Hey guys, tonight we're slipping beneath the animal skin covers of a Viking longhouse where love is loud, legal, and sometimes lethal. The fire crackles low, someone is snoring nearby, and you, yes, you, have just agreed to marry a stranger in front of 40 witnesses, with a sheep grazing casually between you. It's chilly, smoky, and your betrothed hasn't bathed since last Thorablot. You're going to need more than flowers and candlelight here. In Viking society, love and marriage weren't just private affairs of the heart, they were transactions, contracts, and power moves negotiated between families. Sure, there were feelings, sometimes, but mostly it was about land, lineage, and livestock. And yes, if you're wondering, there were ways to get out of it, but good luck with that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing ankle deep in packed snow, squinting at the pale sun, and beside you, two families are loudly arguing over sheep. This, oddly enough, is a love story. Marriage in Viking Age. Scandinavia wasn't so much a tale of passion as it was of paperwork. With none of the paperwork, love could be a lucky bonus, sure, but what mattered most was the agreement, a formal contract between your family and your intendeds, often arranged years before you'd hit puberty. Parents negotiated your bride price, munder, dowry, hymenphilgia, and wedding feast costs like seasoned diplomats. You just showed up. And don't think you could sneak off and marry in secret. That wasn't legally binding. No witnesses, no law. The lawmen, called Lagsagamotr, made sure marriages were heard, seen, and recorded orally at the Thing, Viking legal assembly. Secret love might be fun in the sagas, but in reality, it meant no legal protections if your husband died or turned out to be a thrall with a good comb. Betrothal itself was often enough to start disputes. If your father promised you to one family, then changed his mind later, well, blood could be spilled before the first wedding mead was even poured. Love triangles, try love hexagons, with axes. Still, not all Viking couples were strangers. Occasionally, young men and women actually chose each other, usually from neighboring farms or gatherings like the Thing. If you were lucky, you'd court your partner first with gifts, a cloak pin, carved runes, or even a modest blade. Romantic, in a here's a practical weapon kind of way. One curious legal oddity, the hand-fasting ceremony, where hands were clasped before witnesses, wasn't necessarily binding. What mattered more was the feast afterward. If your wedding had enough guests, enough ale, and enough meat, you were as good as lawfully wed. That's right, your legal status could hinge on whether your Uncle Gorm attended the buffet. And let's not forget the bed test. After the feast, the couple was expected to sleep together to complete the marriage, but again, it had to be witnessed or verified, sometimes by women from the household. Privacy was optional. Pressure was not. Now, you might be wondering, what if one party was underage or objected? The age of consent was fuzzy, sometimes as young as 12 for girls, 15 for boys. And consent? Technically, a bride could protest, but if her family had agreed, the law often steamrolled over her opinion. Still, some sagas mention spirited women who refused matches and got away with it, at least in fiction. In real life, resistance was risky. Here's your fun fringe fact. Some Viking wedding ceremonies included fertility rituals, like stepping over a sword or circling a fire thrice, probably to encourage both courage and pregnancy. No pressure, though. And now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Viking women had genuine agency in marriage or whether their legal rights were more symbolic than practical. Some point to the Grágás, Icelandic law code, giving women rights to divorce, property, and even witness status in some cases. Others say these were exceptions, not the norm. So where does this leave you? Shivering in your best woolen tunic, holding a ceremonial ring that used to be part of your uncle's arm ring stash? Right in the middle of a society where love, law, and livestock braided together like a plaited beard? Your marriage isn't just about romance, it's a legal alliance, a wealth transfer, and a community event. You better hope that stew is good. Tomorrow. You'll have to start figuring out what happens after the wedding. But for now, the feast continues. Someone just spilled ale down your leg, and the bride's cousin is eyeing you like you forgot the bride price. Welcome to Viking romance. Hope you brought a lawyer. You wake up to the smell of smoke, mead, and cold sweat. Your wedding feast is barely over, bits of boiled lamb still lodged in your teeth, and already someone is yelling outside the longhouse. That's because your betrothal, that beautiful legally binding bundle of meat, money, and marital promise, has just triggered a feud. In Viking culture, betrothal wasn't a casual affair, it was a declaration of family alliances and future inheritances. And if the wrong person got left out, insulted, or worse, intentionally bypassed, blood might be shed before the couple even lit a hearth together. Right now, two families are squaring off over land. Turns out, the patch of grazing field that your new spouse's uncle promised as part of the dowry actually wasn't his to give. That field had been quietly claimed by a second cousin from the other side of the fjord, and that cousin brought witnesses. Feuds weren't just melodramatic family drama, they were semi-legitimate legal responses to slights, insults, and broken agreements. In fact, under Viking law, failing to uphold a betrothal agreement could be seen as breach of contract if silver or property had already exchanged hands, and the marriage didn't happen. Someone owed someone else, or else. So what do you do now? Well, first, you don't speak. Not yet. Let the elders and law speakers do their posturing. Second, check that your axe isn't visible. A visible weapon right now could escalate things fast. And third, try not to stand near the fire pit. That's where disputes often start. Centered, symbolic, and convenient for tossing things. Betrothal ceremonies were usually witnessed by kin, neighbors, and sometimes the local chieftain. This wasn't just pomp. Witnesses could later testify about what was said, who agreed, and who toasted first. And yes, who toasted first mattered. If the wrong person raised their horn too early, it could imply seniority, or intent, or ownership. That's how carefully choreographed these things were. You might be wondering, why didn't they just write things down? Well, most Viking law was oral. The thing assemblies relied on memory, repetition, and poetic devices to record legal precedents. So if a betrothal was broken, everyone remembered it and sang about it. That saga about the bride who ran off with a merchant from Hedeby? It's still being recited, with extra verses added every year. Fringe detail time. In some parts of Norway and Iceland, a betrothal could be voided if the groom turned out to be impotent. But to prove it, a public examination? No pressure. And what about the bride? Did she have any say? Technically, yes. A woman could protest a betrothal, and if she did it before the thing and had witnesses to her objection, the match might be nullified. But in practice, families didn't take kindly to refusals. In some sagas, defiant daughters are locked away, married off in secret, or sent to nunneries after Christianity arrived. Still, the idea of a betrothed woman had weight. If someone seduced or kidnapped a betrothed girl, they were not only insulting her, but her whole family. This wasn't just romantic betrayal, it was legal theft of honor. And the punishment? Anything from financial compensation to flat-out killing. Historians still argue whether Viking feuds over love were truly about passion, or whether they were just excuses to flex power and rearrange alliances. Some believe that behind every lovesick Viking in the sagas is a much more pragmatic chess move about land and legacy. Now, imagine you're that poor cousin who got left out of the engagement talks. You were promised a bride 2 years ago. You've already started carving the runes for her name on your arm ring, and now she's marrying this guy. What do? You gather your kin. You march to the longhouse. You shout your claim in front of the hearth. You demand repayment or vengeance, and if the law can't help you, well, then you wait for the wedding feast to end. You wait until the moon is high and the guard dogs are drowsy, and you find a quiet way to make your feelings known, with a torch, a blade, or a carefully worded insult that will spread like wildfire come morning. Feuds didn't always end in violence. Sometimes they were resolved at the next thing with a peace oath and shared ale. Sometimes compensation was paid in livestock or silver. And sometimes, rarely, people just moved on. But more often than not, once a betrothal was broken or dishonored, the wound festered for generations. Family sagas were full of them. The feud between the Ljotzen brothers and the Gold Swan clan, still referenced in legal disputes 70 years later. So you sit back, sip your leftover mead, and try not to look anyone in the eye. Because in the Viking world, love wasn't just risky, it could start a war. And you're already married, technically, better hope you made the right deal. The snow hasn't melted, but your marriage has officially begun, and it's not all smooches and soft lighting. In fact, the first gift you give your new spouse is not a flower or a poem, but a knife. That's not a metaphor. In Viking society, love tokens were real things, often knives, keys, brooches, or even pieces of finely carved bone. These weren't just sentimental keepsakes, they were also indicators of social and legal status. A man might give his bride a knife he forged himself. A woman might give him a key to her family's storage chest, symbolizing trust, and a whole lot of pickled fish. Objects mattered. They could double as declarations. If someone gave you a gift of value and witnesses saw it, it could later be used as legal evidence of a promise, marriage, loyalty, or inheritance. Yes, even a brooch could testify in court. And if the object had been exchanged under oath, say, at the thing, then it had legal teeth. Refusing to honor that pledge later could result in loss of property or public humiliation, or both. But back to the knife. You're carving a small sliver of wood by the hearth, not because you're nervous, but because you're proving your skills. Many love tokens were handmade, rune-carved pendants, intricately knotted cords, or bits of amber with small animals etched into them. The craftsmanship wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a display of worth. If you could make beautiful things, you might be trusted to keep a household. And that knife? It might even be used to protect your spouse one day. Or, if things went badly, against them. A particularly curious custom among certain Norse groups was the exchange of blood knives. Couples would each prick their palm with the same blade, a symbolic mingling of blood, not legally binding, but deeply emotional and very dramatic, especially when someone fainted. Still, gifts weren't always romantic. Sometimes they were purely transactional. A man might give his bride's family livestock or land in exchange for her hand, and sometimes the gifts were given after the marriage to sweeten the deal. Oh, you married my daughter and only spilled one drink at the wedding? Here, have a small plot of peat bog. Now here's the odd bit. There were rules about what kind of gift was too generous. If you gave someone an overly lavish present, it could be interpreted as trying to buy them, which was dishonorable and occasionally illegal. Giving your bride a fancy silver torque was sweet. Giving her father a ship and 2 slaves? That raised eyebrows. The law wasn't always clear. Was it a gift? A bribe? An attempt to change someone's legal standing? Historians still argue whether these tokens functioned as social currency or binding legal triggers. In the sagas, a gift given without expectation was praised. But in real life, few things were given without strings attached. One documented fringe case involved a man who gifted his fiancée a fine cloak embroidered with gold thread. She accepted, but later broke the betrothal. He sued her for the cloak. The court ruled that accepting the cloak had implied serious intent, and since she hadn't married him, she owed him equivalent compensation. She paid him in salted cod. It was considered fair. There's also the curious tale of the forgotten token. A widow in Iceland sued her former suitor years after her husband died, claiming he had once given her a decorated comb, thus implying lifelong affection and a marital promise. He denied it. Witnesses disagreed. She lost the case, but kept the comb. The truth is, in Viking society, the line between love, law, and property was fuzzy. You couldn't just whisper sweet nothings. You had to give something, say it aloud, and have people hear it. Everything came down to visibility and memory. What you gave, who saw it, who remembered. You glance at your new spouse across the smoky hall. She's wearing the necklace you gave her, or maybe she's wearing the one from her previous suitor. It's hard to tell. Should you say something? Maybe not. In a world without legal paperwork, memory was law. And memory was fallible. Better carve another rune or 2 into that wooden pendant. Something about loyalty, or luck, or maybe, please don't stab me in my sleep. It's evening again, and the firelight dances across the smoke-darkened beams of the longhouse ceiling. You've finished your chores, splitting wood, checking the goats, unsuccessfully trying to get soot out of your new tunic, and now you're seated beside the hearth. A girl is across from you, fiddling with a bone comb. She looks at you. You look at her. Neither of you says a word, but this is flirting. Viking style. Courtship in the Viking world wasn't about grand declarations or lengthy love letters. It was about quiet signals, cautious glances, and, more often than not, poetry carved in stone. Literally, you might scratch a short stanza into a tree, a horn, or a rock, sometimes in runes, sometimes in riddles. If she deciphered it and smiled, maybe you had a chance. If she told her father, you might be thrown into a snowbank. Tonight, you're thinking about runes. Runes were more than letters. They were tools of mystery and suggestion. A simple message like Ek El Thik, I follow you, might be innocent or threatening. Context was everything. Runes allowed plausible deniability. Did you mean affection, lust, murder? Let the recipient decide. Fringe tidbit. One actual runestone found in Sweden includes the charming message, May this stone stand long, may it rot before it falls. That's Viking flirting. Half sweet, half ominous, all commitment. Back in the hall, someone passes you a cup of ale. You accept, silently, and hold it just a little too long before handing it off. The girl notices. This, too, is part of the game. Flirting wasn't entirely freeform. There were unspoken rules, shaped by custom and law. If a man of lower status openly propositioned a woman of higher rank, especially in public, it could be considered slander. He risked being challenged to a duel, or, worse, a public mockery song. And Viking mockery songs could last generations. No one forgets the verse about Thorstein the Flat-Bottomed. Still, boldness had its rewards. The sagas are full of clever lovers, men and women, who used wordplay and stealth to pursue affection. Some wore disguises, snuck into longhouses disguised as workers or skalds, or left anonymous gifts. Others made romantic advances during the thing, in front of everyone. That was a risky move. If you failed, the public shame could ruin your standing. But if it worked, instant legend. Of course, not every flirtation was welcome. And that's where the law stepped in. Touching someone without permission, even casually, could be interpreted as an insult or threat. Grabbing a woman by the wrist or waist was considered deeply disrespectful, unless you were already betrothed or had her family's consent. If caught, the man might owe her family compensation or face exile. Touch was not neutral. It was a legal act. You might be surprised, then, to learn that some women did the flirting. Viking women, especially in Iceland, could be famously forward. They'd compose verse, send symbolic items, like rings, needles, or carved figurines, and even initiate physical contact if the setting allowed, not in front of the chieftain, mind you, but at the spring festival, anything goes. There's a story in the Laxdæla saga of a woman named Gudrun who lured her suitor with riddles and witticisms until he gave her a cloak, then dumped him for a better match a week later. The cloak, incidentally, was never returned. Legends say she wore it on her wedding day to someone else. Historians still argue whether these sagas reflect real Viking courtship norms or just literary fantasies. Were Viking women truly that bold? Did men compose actual love poems on the spot? Or are these just medieval rom-coms passed down with extra blood? You can't help but wonder. The girl across the fire just scratched something into the bench with her knife. It might be a doodle. It might be your name in runes. You don't ask. You just scratch something in return. A spiral. A symbol of continuity. A soft invitation. This is Viking love. Silent. Coded. Razor-edged. More knife than rose. More smoke than candle. You rise slowly, pretending to fetch more wood. As you pass, she looks at the carving, then at you, then says nothing. That, my friend, is a conversation. The sun never quite rises this time of year. It just drags itself along the horizon like a tired dog. but your feet are already soaked from morning snow, and you're walking behind your cousin who just won himself a bride in the raid on the neighboring fjord. Only, she doesn't look thrilled about it. You're starting to notice something strange. In Viking society, the line between bride and war prize is sometimes paper thin, if paper had existed. What makes a marriage consensual? A vow? A witness? Or just the fact that no one protests loudly enough? This morning, your cousin is grinning and bragging about the flax-haired girl tied to the back of his horse. He says her name is Runa. She hasn't spoken. Capturing women during raids wasn't rare. Viking raids often targeted wealthy monasteries, towns, and yes, villages where eligible women lived. The sagas speak of women who fell in love with their captors, but let's be honest, those stories were usually written by men, centuries later, with a flair for romanticizing coercion. Legally speaking, enslaved or captured women could become concubines, friller, and sometimes even wives if freed and publicly acknowledged, but they entered these unions with few protections. Their children might not inherit. Their status remained precarious unless the man's kin approved. And if he died without naming them in front of witnesses, back to bondage. Now, your cousin insists he intends to make her his wife. He says he'll free her, give her silver, make it right. But right by whose standard? Here's the strange bit. Viking law codes, like the Icelandic Gragos, rarely mention forced marriage outright, but they do emphasize the importance of witnessed consent at the thing. If no witnesses heard the woman say yes, or at least saw her nod, the union might not hold in court. The trick? Many didn't bother asking. Historians still argue whether Viking women could effectively refuse these arrangements. Some laws suggest women had the right to reject suitors. Others say that if her male guardian agreed, her silence was taken as compliance. The truth probably varied, depending on region, class, and who held the axe. And then there's the saga trope of the warrior maiden. Women like Brynhildr, shield maidens who chose their partners or killed those they didn't want. Powerful stuff, but possibly more fantasy than fact. Still, fringe fact incoming. One tale from the Saxo Grammaticus Chronicles tells of a woman who killed her would-be husband with a poisoned brooch after he claimed her post-raid. It was considered clever. She was later married off anyway, but at least she got the first word in. Back at camp, your cousin is presenting Runa to the elders. She stands stiffly, jaw clenched, hands bound. You wonder what her fate will be. The law says nothing clearly. It mumbles. It looks away. You notice something else. She's wearing a pendant, a small hammered disc etched with Thor's hammer. It's worn and bent but still visible, a sign of faith or resistance. Later that night, you pass the fires again. The elders are drinking. Your cousin is laughing. Runa sits apart, eyes flickering toward the hills. You think she's counting escape routes. Tomorrow, maybe she'll be freed. Maybe there'll be a wedding feast. Maybe she'll be given new clothes, a seat by the hearth, a knife of her own. But tonight, she sleeps with one eye open. And you start to understand why some Viking marriages begin with silence, and stay there. You're waking up to the sound of snoring, 3 different pitches, one of them from the goat in the corner, and you stretch under the weight of a wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke, sheep, and something like fermented cabbage. Your new wife is already up, stoking the fire. She doesn't speak. That's fine. Today, You're learning the laws of Viking marriage, not the romantic kind, but the kind with clauses, loopholes, and social side eyes. Viking society was technically monogamous. That's what the Christian monks insisted when they arrived. Quills at the ready. One man, one wife. But peel back the rune-covered curtain, and you'll find that Viking marriage law allowed for a bit of interpretive dancing. There's a difference between Kona, the primary, legally wedded wife, and Frilla, the secondary woman, often a concubine or unofficial partner. A man could only have one legal wife at a time, but no law explicitly banned additional, unofficial arrangements. In practice, a wealthy farmer or chieftain might have a frilla living nearby, or even under the same roof, especially if the primary wife approved or couldn't stop him. But only the Kona had legal status. Only she could manage property, attend the thing as a widow, or initiate a divorce. The frilla, she got gifts, protection, and sometimes even affection, but rarely rights. Still, many Viking men stayed with one woman their entire lives, more out of practicality than piety. Managing two households in a world where winters could kill your livestock overnight? That took more than love. It took silver strategy, and enough fish to feed an army. Now, about marrying in the first place. A legal Viking marriage required three key things. 1. Mutual agreement between the families. 2. A bride price, mundar, paid by the groom's family to the brides. 3. Witnesses, usually men from the local community, who could swear that the deal was made and heard. Without these, a marriage might be considered loose or invalid, and that could cause big problems down the line, especially if property or children were involved. Fringe fact. In some regions, if a man lived with a woman for a year and they shared food and bed, their union could be recognized under a kind of common law cohabitation, but again, only if no one else objected. The law liked things neat, and Viking lives were rarely neat. Let's say your wife wants to bring her own property into the marriage. Women could own land, livestock, tools, even slaves. And when she married, she retained rights to that personal property, losafe. If you sold her best goat without asking, she could sue you at the thing, and she might win. Historians still argue whether these laws truly empowered women or just protected male family interests. Some scholars suggest that property rights existed mainly to preserve wealth within bloodlines, not to promote individual autonomy. Others see glimpses of real agency, especially in widow cases, where women could manage estates and make legal decisions without a male guardian. Back in your longhouse, you're chewing on cold barley bread and watching your wife sew a patch onto your only good tunic. She hasn't spoken to you since the wedding feast, but she did leave an extra piece of smoked fish in your bowl last night. A peace offering. Maybe. You wonder if she likes you, or if she's already thinking about a divorce clause. Yes. Divorce. It wasn't just legal in Viking culture, it was surprisingly common. Either spouse could initiate it, though the method varied. Men might simply declare it at the thing. Women had a more theatrical option, standing in the doorway of the house, with witnesses present, and declaring themselves divorced, sometimes naming exactly why, for all to hear. But that's for later. For now, you're still newly married. Still unsure whether she's going to hand you that mended tunic or hurl it at your head. Either way, you're legally hers, and she's legally yours, for better or for winter. You're standing at the threshold of your longhouse, 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, and your wife is staring you down like she's about to read from a script. That's because she is. This is not a good sign. In Viking society, divorce wasn't just possible, it was performative. And today, you're about to experience what it looks like when a woman decides she's had enough of your forgetfulness, your late night mead burping, and that incident with the missing butter. To dissolve a marriage legally, Viking women didn't need a courtroom. They needed the doorway. A woman could initiate divorce by stepping onto the threshold of their shared home and declaring her intent, twice in front of witnesses. Once inside, once outside. It sounds theatrical because it was. That doorway marked the boundary of her status as a wife. Once she crossed it with her intention stated clearly, the marriage was legally over. And what did she need to say? Usually something along the lines of, I divorce you for neglect, abuse, or insult. Sometimes the reasons were very specific. He beat me. He failed to provide for me. Or my personal favorite from an old Icelandic text. He wore women's clothing and made fun of my kin. The law was surprisingly open-ended about justifications. Right now, your wife says something about the butter, and about you using her weaving weights as fishing sinkers. You try to object, but she raises her hand and speaks the formula again, louder. This time, and behind her, 2 of her cousins, standing with arms crossed, not blinking. You are now legally divorced. And yes, she gets to keep her dowry. Under Viking law, property brought into the marriage by the wife, known as losafe, remained hers. Anything she added to the household after the wedding, from combs to cows, she could take back. She also kept half of the shared marital property, unless you could prove misconduct, which, considering the weaving weight situation, you probably can't, but the law wasn't all one-sided. If she cheated on you, publicly insulted your kin, or tried to poison your mother, again, not uncommon in sagas, you could argue for a divorce and claim compensation. But cheating had to be proven, and public shaming wasn't always reliable. If you falsely accused her, you might end up outlawed. Here's a curious fringe detail. In some parts of early Iceland, there were time limits on certain divorce declarations. If your spouse beat you, you had to declare divorce immediately, while showing the bruise to witnesses. Wait too long, and the injury no longer counted. Cold comfort. Literally. Historians still argue whether Viking divorce laws favored women or simply allowed them slightly more dignity than in other medieval societies. Some scholars point to strong female characters in sagas, women who divorce, remarry, and run estates, as signs of real agency. Others caution that these stories often reflect elite households, not average farmsteads where leaving a marriage could mean social ruin. You, meanwhile, are wondering where you're going to sleep tonight. The longhouse is hers, at least in part, if it was her family's land, or she contributed to the building. She might claim the hearthside spot. You might get the barn, or the woodshed, or your brother's boat, if he's feeling generous. Divorce didn't necessarily mean enmity, though, in some cases, ex-spouses stayed neighbors. Shared custody of livestock, yes, really, required ongoing negotiation. And if children were involved, that got complicated. The father usually retained guardianship of sons. Daughters might remain with the mother until marriageable age, but again, that depended on property, status, and how many relatives had opinions. You look down at your boots, wondering if you'll at least get to keep them. She notices. She sighs. She says you can keep the boots, but not the goat. You nod. Fair. Because sometimes love ends not with a shout, but with a firm voice on a frosty threshold, and a goat walking smugly away into the snow. The hearth is smaller now, and so is your pride. You've been sleeping in your cousin's spare hayloft ever since the divorce, and while you're grateful for the roof, you're starting to realize just how much who gets to sit by the fire matters in Viking society. Today, you're learning that a Viking household was less about love and more about logistics and law. Welcome to the politics of hearth sharing. A typical longhouse could shelter 20-30 people, extended family, servants, thralls, guests, and sometimes even that one weird uncle who spoke only in proverbs. It was smoky, cramped, and rank with the smell of fish, sweat, and old wool. But it was also the core of domestic power, and the hearth was its legal center. Where you sat in the longhouse wasn't just a matter of warmth. It was a physical manifestation of your status. The head of the household, usually the husband, but sometimes the widow or a powerful matriarch, sat in the high seat near the central fire. Guests were seated according to rank. The further you were from the hearth, the less influence you had. Sit too close without permission? That was social overreach, and someone would notice. You were once second bench, near the salt barrel. Now you're wedged behind a storage box, next to a goat with digestive issues. A downgrade, in every sense. What's more, Viking law reinforced this hierarchy. The husbandi, householder, held legal authority over everyone living under his roof, literally his husfrelsi, or house freedom. That gave him the right to discipline thralls, distribute food, and represent the household in legal matters. But if a wife contributed land, wealth, or lineage to the household, she might demand equal status and even win it. Fringe fact, some households had joint leaders, husband and wife acting as legal equals in property matters. This happened especially in Iceland, where the farming economy and clan alliances meant that women's contributions were harder to ignore, but harmony wasn't guaranteed. Household disputes could spiral into legal feuds, especially over resource distribution. If the husband favored one child or sibling over another, that might provoke inheritance fights. If a wife gave too much food to her natal kin during a famine, that could be interpreted as betrayal. And if a guest insulted the host near the hearth, especially during a feast, there might be blood on the floor before dessert. You remember the last feast you attended as a married man. You sat with your wife beside you, both of you carving dried meat into neat strips. Now she sits beside her brother, who seems to have taken a liking to your knife. He's using it to pick his teeth. You stew quietly in your corner. Let's talk about chores. Daily work was divided, but not strictly by gender. Men handled farming, hunting, trade, and defense. Women managed the home, food stores, cloth making, and animals. But women also oversaw budgets, guest lists, and settlement disputes. Some women even ran farms alone while their husbands were off raiding or permanently missing. If you live under someone else's roof, you owe them labor. But there's a legal catch. If you contribute a significant share to the household economy, like livestock, trade profits, or essential skills, you can claim partial standing. That means you get a say in major decisions, and your departure or expulsion must be legally justified. Historians still debate whether this system empowered Viking women or simply reflected their economic indispensability. Some argue women had autonomy primarily through wealth and widowhood. Others highlight the saga's many capable wives and mothers who negotiate alliances, settle disputes, and even wield swords when needed. But those sagas rarely mention the middle folk, the unremarkable men and women who stir porridge, stitch cloaks, and quietly resent each other over who gets the bigger spoon. Tonight, you're back in your cousin's house. He gives you a nod and hands you a bowl of barley. Mash. You nod back and sit near the entrance, where the cold leaks in and the smoke stings your eyes. No one says much. You miss your old spot by the fire, even if your wife did burn your tunic, even if her goat hated you. Because in the Viking world, a warm seat wasn't just about comfort. It meant you mattered. And right now, you're just a shadow on the wall. The old man dies on a Tuesday, or maybe it's Thursday. No one's quite sure, because the days are short, the firewood is damp, and you're too busy helping lift his body onto the burial sledge to ask. What you do know is this: he was your wife's uncle, or ex-wife's uncle. And now that he's gone, everything he owned, his land, his tools, his 5 goats, and the particularly fine cloak with silver stitching, has become a legal battlefield. Welcome to the world of Viking widows, wealth, and watchful eyes. A death in the household sets off a chain reaction. Mourners gather, ale is poured, stories are shared, some flattering, some not, and behind the smoky curtain of grief, the real work begins, sorting out what goes to whom. Viking inheritance laws were fairly clear, on paper, but in practice, grief and greed don't always follow the rules. A man's legitimate children, particularly sons, were usually first in line. If no sons, then daughters. If no children, then siblings, nephews, or even cousins. The catch? All claims had to be presented publicly, often at the thing, where other potential heirs could argue their case, sling accusations, or, in some cases, start duels. But what about the widow? Viking women, once widowed, didn't automatically lose everything. In fact, a widow had the right to reclaim her dowry, any losa-fé, personal property, and sometimes even a share of her late husband's estate, especially if she had managed it during his lifetime. She might continue to live on the land, oversee the livestock, and even represent the family in court if no adult sons were available. You're watching this exact situation unfold. Your ex-wife, let's call her Sigrid, is now standing in the center of the longhouse, holding a ledger stick. She's calmly listing everything she contributed to the household. 6 ewes, 1 bronze cauldron, 2 lengths of dyed wool, and a spinning wheel carved with her father's initials. The uncles nod. No one disputes it, yet. But there's tension in the air. Her cousin, Rolf, has brought 2 witnesses who claim the goats were actually his grandfather's. Someone else is saying the silver cloak was borrowed. And in the corner, a boy no one's seen before insists he's the dead man's bastard son. Fringe fact, in Icelandic law, bastards, lausungar, could inherit if publicly acknowledged by the father and if their mother was freeborn. Otherwise, they were usually excluded, unless they had powerful allies. This led to many late-life deathbed declarations and more than a few suspicious midwinter adoptions. Now Sigrid is making her next move. She invokes her rights as a managing widow, explaining that while her husband was ill, she oversaw the fields, negotiated the salt trade, and kept the livestock alive through 2 snowstorms. She brought value, and she expects that to be honored. Here's where it gets delicate. If the relatives push too hard, they risk insulting her. That's dangerous, because in some regions, a widow could accuse challengers of dishonoring the dead, and that accusation, if proven, could require public apology, payment of shame compensation, nidingsbeitur, or even exile. But if she overreaches, they might accuse her of greed, or worse, of plotting the death. The Vikings had no patience for women who mourned too quickly or dressed too well after a funeral. Superstition ran deep. Historians still argue how much real power widows had. Some claim that widowhood was a woman's peak moment of legal independence, free from father, husband, or son. Others argue that power only came with wealth, and many widows were quickly remarried to cement alliances or protect assets. Back in the hall, the arguments die down. Sigrid has agreed to give up the cloak in exchange for full rights to the goats. Rolf scowls but doesn't object. The boy with the big inheritance dreams is given a bowl of stew and asked to prove his story at next month's thing. For now, the fire is stoked, the room relaxes, and Sigrid sits, back in the seat of authority she once shared, now her own. You, sipping your ale from the corner, wonder what she'll do next. Remarry? Expand the farm? Travel to her sisters in Hedeby and start a flax empire? Whatever she chooses, it's hers to decide. Because in Viking law, when a woman survived long enough and knew her rights, she didn't just inherit land, she inherited power. It starts with a goat. It always starts with a goat. You're at the thing, standing in a crowd of cloaked figures, snow crunching underfoot, as two brothers argue, loudly, over who owns the animal chewing on someone's wool mitten. It has a crooked horn, a smug expression, and the unique ability to cause a full-scale inheritance dispute. Welcome to Viking Property Law 101. Who gets the goat, and why it might determine the fate of an entire farm. Property in the Viking world wasn't just about land. It included livestock, tools, buildings, textiles, jewelry, and even that suspiciously fine cloak Uncle Kettle brought back from a friend in the East. Everything had value, and everything had the potential to spark conflict when someone died or disappeared on a raid. Right now, the two brothers, let's call them Eric and Sten, are debating whether their late father promised the goat to Eric as part of his share of the inheritance, or whether Sten had already traded it for a small axe 3 winters ago. The goat, meanwhile, seems content to ignore the matter entirely. So, how did Viking law handle this? With an eye toward fairness and an ear for drama, inheritance was typically divided among legitimate male heirs, though daughters could inherit if there were no sons, or in some cases, alongside them. The key was proving your claim and, more importantly, proving that your version of the truth had more witnesses than your opponent's. Items were often passed down based on value and symbolism. A sword might go to the eldest son, a weaving loom to the daughter who ran the household, a boat to the son who still had all his fingers. But disputes were common, especially when oral promises clashed with remembered gifts. In the goat situation, the Thing's law speaker listens carefully to both sides. Eric claims the goat was part of the livestock division agreed upon last spring. Sten insists it was borrowed, and that Eric conveniently forgot to return it. They both have witnesses. Cousins. Neighbors. A man who once saw the goat sneeze on Eric's tunic. Fringe fact. Some disputes over livestock were settled by oath circles, where each party swore an oath with a group of supporters. sometimes with hands on sacred objects or even swords. Whoever had the stronger backing, or the most to lose by lying, typically won. There's also the concept of odal rights. Ancestral land could not be sold outside the family unless all kin waived their claim. If Sten argues the goat was part of an odal property, and Eric tried to trade it away, things could escalate. And don't forget, if a woman brought the goat into the marriage as part of her dowry, she might legally retain partial ownership, even after her husband's death. If she remarried, her new husband might step in. That's right, goats with stepfathers. Viking law was nothing if not thorough. You step back as the crowd murmurs. A third brother has emerged. Of course there's a third brother. He claims he gave the goat to their father in the first place, which makes it his, technically. This is where it gets deliciously messy, because property law in Viking society often relied on memory, symbolic acts, and consensus. If someone could produce a token of transfer, a carved bone, a braid of wool, or even a piece of broken tool, that might tip the scales. If no evidence existed, the thing's assembly might vote based on reputation. Who's more honest? Who paid their taxes? Who brought ale to last year's feast? Historians still argue how often property law was enforced consistently. Some believe it favored the loudest or wealthiest claimants. Others point to the durability of Icelandic law codes like Gragas, which detail astonishingly specific inheritance rules, including shares for illegitimate children and stipulations for shared ownership of a single cloak. In the end, the goat goes to Eric. Barely. The deciding factor? A knotted cord tied to the goat's neck that matched a set his wife had woven, clearly meant as part of his share. Sten scowls, mutters something about next harvest, and stalks off. The goat sneezes again. You, meanwhile, have learned a valuable lesson. Viking property law wasn't just about fairness. It was about storytelling. Whoever could tell the most convincing tale, laced with facts, backed by faces, and wrapped in ritual, won. Because in a world without deeds or documents, the truth belonged to the one who remembered it best. And the goat? He just keeps chewing. You're sitting in the back of the longhouse, next to a flickering torch, and an old woman who smells like fish stew and judgment. Across from you, a young man is trying, very poorly, to prove he's someone's son. This isn't just a family drama, it's a legal claim. In Viking society, blood mattered. A lot. And proving it could mean the difference between inheriting a farm or being laughed out of the thing with a wooden bowl and no last name. Welcome to the tangled world of Viking inheritance games and the slippery status of bastards. Legitimate children, Byrne, had clear claims to their father's estate. Sons were usually prioritized, but daughters had rights too, especially if no sons existed. But illegitimate children, or Lausungar, lived in a gray area. Some were acknowledged and raised with partial rights. Others were hidden, disowned, or conveniently forgotten, until someone died. And suddenly that unofficial son remembered he had a cow-shaped claim on the family barn. The young man now standing awkwardly in front of the hearth says his name is Hrafen. He's maybe 17, built like a pine sapling, and clutching a carved comb he claims belonged to his mother, a servant woman who died last year. He says she told him his father was the deceased farmer who owned this hall. Problem is, no one else remembers her. Or if they do, they're pretending not to. In Viking law, A child born out of wedlock could inherit only if the father acknowledged them, preferably in front of witnesses. This might happen during the child's birth, a feast, or on the father's deathbed. If no public declaration existed, the child's only hope was reputation and resemblance. Hrafen tries to smile. His nose is, admittedly, very similar to the late farmer's. Someone mentions that his ears tilt the same way too. Another mutters about how he walks like his supposed uncle. And then, your favorite part, comes the gossip clause. That's not its official name, but it might as well be. Viking law sometimes allowed communal consensus to shape legal identity. If enough people in a community said, "Aye, that's his lad," the thing might accept the claim. Of course, there had to be no better claimant, no official heir willing to challenge the story. And if a claim turned out to be false, the penalty could include outlawry, shame, or a well-placed axe. Fringe tidbit. One saga tells of a man who proved his parentage by producing a distinctive birthmark, shaped like a raven, known to run in his father's family. Whether this was real, coincidence, or just good branding, no one knows. But it worked. Back to Hrafen. An older woman stands up, his supposed aunt. She remembers his mother. She says she saw her speaking with the farmer late one autumn, and that the child was always fed better than the other farm hands. She nods once. That might be enough. But inheritance isn't just about birth. It's also about behavior. If Hrafen can prove he served the household, contributed labor, and honored his supposed father's name, he might earn partial claim, what some regions called herkunniger, or known kin. It's not full sonship, but it's something. Historians still argue how often bastards were actually accepted into inheritance circles. Some scholars say the flexibility reflects a pragmatic society. If you needed more hands for the farm, you found a way to include people. Others insist these cases were rare, and that bloodlines were more jealously guarded than the winter ale stash. The thing votes. You're surprised. Enough heads nod. Enough hands rise. Hrafen gets 1 sheep, 2 sacks of barley, and a rusted hoe. Not a fortune, but more than nothing. More than most. He bows awkwardly. Someone slaps his back. A child whispers, "Bastard," and gets smacked with a ladle. You sip your drink and think, in this world, being born isn't enough. You have to be remembered, claimed, believed. Tomorrow, someone else will show up with another story, another object, another nose that looks suspiciously familiar, and the law will squint, shrug, and say, "Prove it." You're at a feast, technically. There's mead, boiled meat, laughter, the rhythmic thump of someone trying to drum on a cheese wheel, but no one is really listening to the music. They're listening to the insults. 2 men are standing near the fire, faces redder than the coals, locked in a vicious verbal duel. It started with a joke about hairlines. Then someone mentioned goats. Now, the word Nightinger has just been shouted, and you feel the tension snap like a bowstring. You lean closer. This isn't just entertainment anymore. This is legal. Welcome to Viking defamation law, where a single word could cost you silver, honor, or your life. The Vikings took reputation seriously, so seriously that public insults were matter of law, not just bruised egos. In a society without police or written records, your standing was everything. If someone called you a liar, a coward, or worse, a Nightinger, a deeply shameful, unmanly person, they might have to back it up in court or in combat. You watch as the taller man, Halldor, accuses the shorter one, Leif, of sleeping with thralls, cheating at dice, and smelling like a drowned dog in summer. Harsh, but still in jest. Then Leif accuses Halldor of fathering a child with his cousin's wife and refusing to name the child. That's not just rude, that's actionable. Here's how it works. Under Viking law, insults, nide, were divided into levels. Some were just rude, others were legally slanderous. Calling someone a thief, a coward, or accusing them of unmanly behavior, like being the woman in a sexual act, could be considered full slander. That kind of accusation, if unfounded, required a fine, if it was public, with witnesses, even more. But if the insult damaged someone standing, say, at the thing, it could lead to a holmgang, a duel, 2 men, 1 field, a couple of shields, and whoever walked away won the argument, and possibly the land. Fringe fact: women could be accused of shameful behavior too, usually involving adultery, laziness, or witchcraft. But if you insulted a woman wrongly, her male relatives had the right to sue or challenge you themselves. In some sagas, a single false accusation led to 3 deaths, a house burning, and someone being exiled to Greenland. Rough times. Leif is demanding compensation, 3 ounces of silver, an apology in front of witnesses, and a seat closer to the fire at the next feast. Halldor refuses, says the accusation was true, says the child even has his eyes. Now you're in dangerous territory, because if the insult was true, it's not slander, it's fact. But Halldor has no witnesses. And Leif just offered to swear an oath that it's false, with 3 neighbors backing him. Historians still argue how seriously these laws were enforced. Some say the fines were symbolic, more about saving face than exchanging wealth. Others believe that public accusations, especially during festivals or things, could change a man's fate forever, lose your honor, and you might lose your marriage, your trade deals, even your inheritance. The crowd is quiet now. Halldor stares at Leif. You hear someone whisper, "Let them fight." But they don't. Instead, an elder woman steps forward, Leif's aunt. She scolds both men, declares that only fools duel over rumors, and throws a ladle into the fire for dramatic effect. The spell breaks. Someone laughs. Someone starts playing the cheese wheel again. Leif walks away with his reputation bruised but intact. Halldor sulks and pokes the fire with a stick. Tomorrow, there might still be consequences. Maybe a suit filed at the thing, maybe a private meeting over ale, or maybe they'll just pretend it never happened. Until next time, you sip your drink, relieved. Because in the Viking world, your name was your currency, your word was your shield, and an insult once spoken could follow you to the grave and, or worse, into the sagas. You're holding a silver ring. It's heavy, cold, and shaped like a coiled serpent biting its tail. You're not admiring the craftsmanship, though. You're counting its weight, carefully, because someone's been killed, and now it's time to decide how much his life was worth. This is Vergild, literally man price. In Viking law, it's the amount of compensation owed when one person kills another. It's not revenge, it's justice, it's math, but it's not simple. The dead man's family is here, grim-faced and silent. The killer, a tall trader named Jorund, stands across the fire, arms crossed. He claims it was an accident. The family says otherwise. You were there. It was a drinking game. There was a goat involved. Someone got shoved. Someone didn't get up. Now, the community has to decide who owes what and how much. Vergild was meant to prevent endless cycles of blood vengeance. Instead of starting a feud, the killer could pay compensation to the victim's kin. The idea was to assign a value to the life lost, based on social status, gender, and occasionally profession. A free man might be worth 200 silver pieces, a chieftain, much more, a thrall, often nothing at all. Yes, that's as brutal as it sounds. The law speaker steps forward, reciting the rules. The dead man, Halfdan, was a farmer, mid-ranked, no criminal history, with 4 children and an excellent beard. His Vergild is calculated at 120 silver pieces, plus 15 more because it happened during a feast. That's a surcharge for bad timing. Fringe fact: in some places, Viking law even specified extra payment if the killing was especially dishonorable, like in the back or during sleep. There's also grave robbing compensation, accidental stabbing while hunting, and even a fine for throwing someone into a freezing river during an argument. Legal codes were exhaustive. Joran nods. He agrees to pay, but slowly, in 3 installments, with some sheep thrown in. The family hesitates. They wanted more, but the thing votes, and the ruling stands. This time, justice is silver, not steel. But here's the wrinkle. What if Joran couldn't pay? If a killer couldn't afford the Vergild, the options narrowed. He might be forced into servitude until the debt was repaid. Or his relatives might cover part of it to save his skin. If no one paid, he could be declared an outlaw, a person outside the protection of the law. Then, anyone could kill him without legal consequence. Historians still argue whether the Vergild system was actually fair, or just a tool for the wealthy to avoid vengeance. Poorer folk, after all, rarely had enough silver to pay, and women's lives? Often valued at half a man's in early law codes, unless they were pregnant, noble-born, or politically useful. Still, the system did prevent bloodshed, at least sometimes. You remember one case, years ago, where a boy accidentally killed his cousin with a thrown axe during a woodcutting contest. His father paid in reindeer hides and 2 swords. The families stayed on speaking terms. The cousin's brother even became the boy's blood brother later. It wasn't forgotten, but it was handled. Tonight, after the ruling, Jorund approaches the family with his first payment, 2 silver bracelets, a bag of barley, and a sheepskin cloak. It's symbolic, a gesture of remorse. The eldest son accepts it, silently. That doesn't mean it's forgiven, but it's accepted. Because in the Viking world, death didn't always demand more death. Sometimes it demanded a number, a goat, a weight of silver pressed into your hand by the man who took everything from you. And then life went on. You're trudging through snow, a little hungover, following a trail of muddy footprints toward the forest. The footprints belong to your neighbor, Bjorn, who, according to the shouting match at last night's feast, might have legally killed someone. Legally killed. That's a thing. Viking justice wasn't all about peace offerings and silver. Sometimes, the law allowed blood, but only under very specific circumstances, and only if you played by the rules. Break those rules. And your honorable revenge could turn into murder. And then, you'd owe a goat, a fine, and possibly your entire reputation. Welcome to the blurry line between legal killing and unlawful slaughter. Let's say someone kills your brother. You're outraged. Obviously, you want justice. You could sue them at the thing. But if the killer refuses to pay Wergild or laughs in your face, you might seek revenge, and the law might let you. Viking law included the right to vengeance in certain cases, particularly if the killing was recent, witnessed, and within your kinship rights. But it wasn't a free-for-all. There were rules. For example, you couldn't kill someone on a holy day or within the bounds of a thing meeting. You couldn't stab them while they slept, cowardly, or murder them in a sanctuary like a church, later, once Christianity crept in. And you definitely couldn't kill someone who was already paying their debts or protected under someone else's household. Do any of those apply to Bjorn? Possibly. The man he killed, Torfi, was found near the boathouse with an axe in his shoulder and a letter in his hand. That letter, rumor says, was a formal challenge from Bjorn, delivered a week ago, after Torfi was accused of stealing Bjorn's wife's cloakpin. If true, this could be a settled fight, not a murder. Now, a settled fight was one where both parties agreed to duel. These were often regulated at the thing or witnessed by neighbors. A public holmgang duel was legal, even admired. The winner walked away a hero. The loser, well, not so much. But if one side cheated, used poison, or attacked in secret, the honor vanished, and the law came knocking. Fringe fact, in some Viking regions, there were duel stones, large flat rocks where challenges were fought. Some even had carved footprints where duelists were meant to stand. Leave your spot mid-duel, you lost. Step off out of fear, public disgrace. Back to Bjorn. He claims he challenged Torfi fairly. Says Torfi refused to show up. So Bjorn confronted him at the boathouse, where words turned to shouts, and shouts turned to axe blows. Witnesses? A shepherd boy, half asleep, a thrall with hearing problems. Not ideal. Now the elders must decide, was this a lawful revenge, or a murder dressed up as tradition? Historians still argue how much of Viking law actually curbed vengeance, and how much it simply redirected it into legal forms. Some believe that the rules around legal killing were pragmatic attempts to contain chaos. Others think they reflect a deeper cultural obsession with honor, face-saving, and performative masculinity. What's clear, if you were going to kill someone, you better do it properly. Tonight, the thing gathers. The arguments are made. Bjorn's axe is examined. The boy testifies badly. Someone makes a joke about cloakpins being cursed. In the end, the ruling is this. Bjorn's act was partially justified, but improperly timed. He's fined a half Wergild, not for the killing, but for violating the peacetime boundary. He pays. Torfi's family grumbles, but accepts. No feud. For now. You walk home, thinking, in the Viking world, revenge could be noble. It could even be legal. But only if it was public, witnessed, and honest. The moment you broke those conditions, you weren't a hero anymore. You were a killer, and you better have silver, or very good boots. You're watching a man walk away from everything he's ever known. No cloak, no sword, no shoes. Just a bundle of rags and the heavy silence of being erased. He's been declared an outlaw, and in Viking law, that might be worse than death. Outlawry, Skogungr, in Old Norse, literally going into the forest, was one of the most serious punishments a person could face. It meant you were no longer protected by law, no rights, no home, no kinship shield. You were a ghost in the eyes of the community. And anyone could kill you without consequence. The man stumbling across the frostbitten heath? His name is Arna. You knew him once. Traded smoked eels with him. He told great stories, especially after ale. Now, no one is allowed to speak to him. He has no place to sleep, no tools, no hope. His crime? He broke the law, not just once, but repeatedly. First, he stole from his neighbor. Then he refused to repay it. Then he attacked the neighbor during a thing meeting, violating sacred space. The assembly voted. The sentence was clear. 3 years of full outlawry, no protection, no return. Survive, if you can. There were 2 kinds of outlawry, full and lesser. Lesser outlawry lasted 3 years. If you returned before time was up, you could be killed on sight. If you survived the exile, you might be allowed back, if the community forgave you and the injured party accepted compensation. Full outlawry, though, permanent. You were cast out forever, not just from your village, but from society itself. Your name became a curse. Your land was seized. Your kin had to publicly distance themselves from you or risk guilt by association. Fringe fact. Some outlawed individuals managed to carve out strange second lives in the wilderness, living in caves, forging secret alliances, or even becoming mercenaries abroad. One Icelandic outlaw, Grettir the Strong, lived for nearly 20 years outside the law, surviving on sheer stubbornness and an unsettling amount of fish. Historians still argue about whether outlawry was meant as mercy or cruelty. Some see it as an alternative to execution, a chance, however slim, at redemption. Others argue it was a social death sentence, wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. You watch Arna reach the edge of the woods. He turns once. No one meets his eyes. That's part of the punishment. He disappears into the trees. You wonder how long he'll last. Outlaws couldn't buy food, couldn't enter markets, couldn't sleep under anyone's roof. They lived off what they could hunt, steal, or trade from the desperate. Some sought out other outlaws and formed ragged communities in the borderlands. Others didn't last the winter. But here's the twist. Outlawry didn't just punish the criminal. It tested the community. If you helped an outlaw, even a cousin, you risked fines or exile yourself. But if you killed an outlaw, you could claim a portion of their property, or even earn praise for cleansing the land. A dark incentive, if ever there was one. Some outlaw stories ended in blood, ambushes in the woods, betrayals by old friends, sudden reappearances at family feasts with a knife under the cloak, but some didn't. Occasionally, an outlaw was forgiven, brought back in a special ritual, reclaimed by kin, the wound healed, publicly. You sit by the fire that night, listening to the wind howl through the trees. You wonder where Arna is now, whether he's hungry, whether he blames you for not speaking up at the thing. You didn't vote for outlawry, but you didn't vote against it either. And in the Viking world, silence is almost always remembered. You're standing in a field surrounded by onlookers. Someone is carrying a rock the size of a small pig. Another person is heating iron in a fire pit. There's even a goose. No, wait. 3 geese, all of them staring, as if they're about to judge you. This somehow is a trial. Because in Viking society, justice wasn't just about testimony and witness accounts. Sometimes, you had to prove your innocence by holding a red-hot iron, bleeding into water, or seeing whether a chicken would sit on your lap. Welcome to the bizarre, theatrical, and occasionally poultry-involved world of Viking trial rituals. Let's back up. Viking law relied heavily on oath-taking and witness memory. But when those failed, when evidence was absent, testimonies conflicted, or everyone was just very drunk, then the court might turn to ordeals. Ordeals were physical or symbolic tests meant to reveal truth through divine or natural judgment. If you were innocent, the gods, or later God, would protect you. If guilty, the injury, pain, or outcome would expose your lies. Today's accused is a woman named Astrid. She's been charged with stealing silver from her neighbor's granary. There's no clear evidence, just a suspicious footprint and a missing bracelet. Her defense? She didn't do it. She's willing to prove it. By trial. Option 1. Trial by hot iron. She carries a piece of red-hot metal for a set number of steps, then has her hand wrapped. After 3 days, the wound is checked. Clean, innocent. Infected, guilty. Option 2. Trial by boiling water. Reach into a cauldron, pull out a stone from the bottom, and let the skin speak for itself. Smooth healing meant divine favor. Blistered palms? Better hope someone brought your will. Option 3. Less brutal. More fringe. Trial by animal behavior. Chickens or geese were sometimes used in rural communities. If the animal reacted calmly to the accused, they were considered innocent. If it screeched, pooped, or flapped away in terror, well, no one wanted to be the person the chicken judged. Astrid chooses the iron, bold. You watch in breathless silence as she walks forward, lips tight, palm open. She lifts the glowing metal. A gasp ripples through the crowd. She walks the required steps, face white, and places the iron back down. A woman rushes in with bandages, wraps the hand carefully, seals it with soot and herbs. Now, the waiting begins. Meanwhile, people exchange theories. One man claims he saw Astrid near the granary 2 nights ago. Another swears the gods would never let a weaver steal. Someone else says she's a witch, citing the time her goat gave birth to twins during a lunar eclipse. You sit on a rock, eating dried fish, trying not to laugh, because it's deadly serious. Historians still argue how much faith Vikings actually placed in these ordeals. Some suggest they were pure theater, with outcomes known in advance and decisions made before the fire was ever lit. Others believe they were sincere acts of faith, desperate appeals to higher judgment in a world where secrets were dangerous and revenge was always an option. Fringe fact. Later Christian-influenced laws included even more elaborate rituals, like fasting before the ordeal, or invoking saints for protection. But in older Norse communities, people often invoked Thor or Freya before taking the iron. If your skin healed, it was said they smiled on you. 3 days pass. You return to the gathering place. Astrid unwraps her hand. The skin is pink, raw, but intact. No infection. The law speaker nods. She is declared innocent. The accuser is fined for false accusation, 10 silver pieces, and public apology. Astrid doesn't say a word. She just walks away, hand raised slightly. Not in triumph, but in proof. You wonder what would have happened if the wound had festered. Would she have fled, fought back, or quietly vanished into outlawry? Because in the Viking world, truth wasn't always about facts. Sometimes, truth had to burn its way into your flesh. You're walking toward a field that looks like someone set up a market, a fair, and a town council meeting all in one, and then sprinkled it with sheep. This is the thing, not a vague thing, not a party, not a vibe. This is the heart of Viking legal life. The outdoor assembly where laws were recited, disputes were settled, alliances forged, insults hurled, and more than a few noses broken, and you're about to attend your very first one as a full voting man. Wear your good tunic. People notice. The thing, also called thing, wasn't a single event. There were local things, regional things, and the Althing in Iceland, which still exists today as one of the world's oldest parliaments. These assemblies happened a few times a year and often lasted several days. They were legal forums, but also social events. Think of them as part court, part festival, part family reunion, with occasional duels. You arrive with your cousin, both of you carrying sacks of barley as bribes, gifts, for the law speaker. Nearby, someone setting up a roasting pit. Over there, a group is debating the finer points of fence line law. In the distance, a woman is loudly accusing her brother-in-law of stealing her comb. Again, the law at the thing was spoken aloud. The Lögsogumadur, law speaker, was a memorizer, not a writer. He would stand on a large rock or mound and recite sections of the law from memory, often in verse, to help it stick. This wasn't just performance, it was preservation. In a world without paper, the voice was the archive. Fringe fact: law speakers were expected to recite the entire law code from memory over the course of 3 years, 1/3 each summer at the Althing. Forget a clause, or get caught inventing. You could be replaced, or worse, mocked. You're here today to witness 2 cases. First, a boundary dispute. 2 families claim the same strip of riverbank. Both produce witnesses. One produces a goat trained to drink only from their side. The law speaker is not impressed. After hours of shouting and one minor fistfight, a compromise is reached. They split the bank. The goat remains neutral. Second, a criminal accusation. A smith claims his apprentice stole silver from the forge. The apprentice denies it. No proof, no witnesses. So they resolve it with oath swearing. This is where you get the famous Viking legal flair. Each party swears a sacred oath in front of the assembled crowd, often invoking gods, ancestors, or both. Breaking that oath, if proven later, meant exile, shame, or fines. Sometimes people swore on swords, on Thor's hammer, or on ancient family heirlooms. The apprentice places his hand on the smith's anvil and swears. His voice trembles. The thing watches. No further evidence arises. The case is dismissed, but the smith eyes him like a man who's counting coins by sound alone. Historians still debate how democratic the thing really was. Some argue it was a true proto-parliament, with voting and open participation. Others note that landowners, chieftains, and elite families often controlled outcomes, especially when bribes and threats were involved. Still, compared to many societies of the time, the thing offered remarkable access to legal recourse, especially in Iceland, where even farmers and some women could bring cases forward, depending on the issue. Fringe fun. In some regions, spectators were expected to remain silent during proceedings, under threat of fine for murmuring. Imagine modern courtrooms with a fee for every side comment. By evening, the field smells like roasted lamb, sweat, and burned herbs. Arguments are mostly resolved. A few new ones have begun. A bard is singing a song that includes the line, "Don't trust a goose in court," which is surprisingly catchy. You're tired, but oddly proud. You watched your neighbors wrestle with law, not just swords. You saw justice done in woolen cloaks and muddy boots, under open skies and watchful sheep, because in the Viking world, law wasn't locked in a tower or sealed in scrolls. It stood in the wind, spoken aloud, held together by memory, mead, and the occasional duel. And somehow, it worked. You're lying awake, staring at the thatched roof, listening to the wind howl like a restless ancestor. Earlier tonight, someone whispered a name they shouldn't have, not a living one, a dead one. And now you're wondering, what if the dead can sue? In Viking belief, the law wasn't just about the living. Sometimes, the dead made claims too, through omens, dreams, hauntings, or sudden sicknesses that no healer could explain. You're now deep in the uncanny territory where law and legend mingle, where ghosts point fingers and the gods weigh guilt. Tonight, the village is whispering about a woman named Yrsa. She buried her husband 3 months ago. Last week, she remarried. And now, the cows won't give milk. The bread won't rise. And 2 children say they saw a pale figure walking along the fjord, dripping water though the ice hasn't melted in weeks. The community suspects her late husband is angry. This isn't just folklore. In Viking culture, the boundaries between the spiritual and legal worlds were porous. If a person died wronged, without justice, proper burial, or unresolved disputes, they might return as a draugr, an undead being with grievances, sometimes malicious, sometimes mournful, always inconvenient. And when the draugr came back, their complaints could be heard legally. The case is brought before the local thing, not formally, but in that between-the-lines way the Norse loved. A neighbor stands up and says, "Strange things are happening." Another says Yrsa remarried quickly. Someone mutters about the missing axe that belonged to her late husband. Suddenly, everyone remembers the old revenge clause. Fringe fact. Some Icelandic sagas describe vengeful dead, taking retribution when their property wasn't properly distributed. One story tells of a man who appeared in a dream, accusing his cousin of hoarding inheritance. The cousin woke up bleeding from the nose and immediately surrendered the goods. You might think this is superstition, but in Viking law, ignoring spiritual unrest could be dangerous. If a household was haunted, the family could be sued for not appeasing the dead. If livestock died mysteriously, and someone suspected sorcery or unfinished vengeance, they could petition the thing to investigate. Some called this spadeomer, prophetic insight. Others just called it good sense. Historians still argue, did Vikings truly believe the dead could haunt them legally? Or was this a clever social tool to force action when logic failed? Either way, it worked. If a dream convinced someone to return stolen goods, or properly bury bones found in the peat bog, justice, of a sort, was served. Back to Yrsa. She stands calmly, denying everything. Says her new husband has treated her well, that she mourned properly, that she buried her first husband with all his items, yes, including the axe. She even points to her dream. 3 nights ago, she says, she saw him smiling, peaceful. The law speaker listens, then offers an ancient solution, a grave appeal. They will reopen the mound and check. You go with them the next morning. The wind has calmed. The frost crunches like old bread under your boots. The burial is undisturbed. The axe is there. No signs of violence, theft, or malice. But someone whispers that the soil felt cold, even for winter. The law speaker declares the dead man settled. Yrsa's name is cleared. The cows start giving milk again. Probably coincidence. Probably. You walk home, uneasy, because in the Viking world, law didn't end at death. Sometimes, justice clawed its way back up. You're huddled by the hearth with two other farmers and a skald who won't stop reciting dirty verses about Thor's left armpit. Outside, the snow is falling sideways, and inside, you're trying to make sense of a strange problem. No one can agree on what the law actually says. Not because it's hidden, not because it's complicated, but because it was never written down in the first place. And now, the people who remembered it are either dead or feuding over who forgot which part. Welcome to the age of oral law, poetic loopholes, and the scribes who changed everything. For centuries, Viking laws were memorized, recited, and passed down like song. Law speakers committed thousands of lines to memory, often in alliterative verse to aid recall. Every summer at the Thing, portions were repeated aloud, like sacred chants. Everyone listened. Everyone remembered. Sort of. But now the world is changing. Christianity has arrived. Monasteries are sprouting. Latin scripts are replacing carved runes. And for the first time, someone is actually writing the laws down. You glance across the fire at a monk with ink-stained fingers. He's working with the local chieftain to record your laws, on parchment, in books, in Latin. You're not sure whether to be impressed or offended. Fringe fact, Iceland's first written law code, Gragos, Grey Goose Laws, was compiled after the island converted to Christianity around the year 1000. But most of it reserved pre-Christian legal customs, just filtered through a monastic lens. Some clauses read like Norse poetry. Others clearly had a few edits to make them, more church-friendly. That's where the confusion begins. What was once fluid, interpreted through local precedent, memory, and performance, is now frozen in ink. The monk says the law says this, but the law speaker says it was always that. And the farmer behind you swears his grandmother told him something entirely different about whether a goat can inherit a barrel of ale. You suddenly realize the law is being translated, not just across language, but across worldview. Christian scribes are reshaping concepts. Property is no longer just about kin. Now it's also about contracts. Vengeance is less acceptable. Forgiveness is trending. Marriage becomes a sacrament, not a transaction. And sorcery, once a complicated part of daily life and spiritual justice, now it's heresy, punishable by burning. Historians still argue how much Norse law was altered during this period. Some say the written codes preserved more than we think. Quirks, clauses, and all. Others argue that once the monks got involved, Viking law was trimmed, tidied, and baptized. Either way, you feel it. Yesterday, your neighbor won a case by swearing an oath in Odin's name. Today, the same oath is rejected unless it's in the name of Christ. Tomorrow, you might not be allowed to bring your axe to the Thing at all. What makes this shift so surreal is that no one ever said, "The old law is gone. It's just morphing." One example, the poetic structure of oral law often allowed for loopholes. If a man said, "I give you this land until the river dries," and then the river changed course, boom, lawsuit. Modern scribes try to fix this with clearer language, but in doing so, they sometimes miss the intent behind the words. You think of a recent dispute over a shared pasture. The old agreement had been verbal, witnessed by 3 people and marked by a carved stone. Now the stone is gone. One witness is dead. And the scribe says, the new version of the law doesn't recognize verbal land transfers without a priest present. Your neighbor is furious. His sheep are confused, because in the Viking world, law was living, and now it's being fossilized. You listen as the skald launches into a parody of one of the new written laws, something about priests refusing to settle fights with axes. The room laughs, uneasy laughter, because deep down, you all know the law isn't just changing, it's slipping away. The stories are fading, the rhythms are breaking, and soon, justice might come in the form of a scroll, not a spoken oath by firelight. You look at the monk again. He dips his pen, keeps writing, head bowed, and you wonder whose laws will he write next. Snow falls in heavy flakes as you walk the familiar path toward the fjord. The wind stings your cheeks, and your boots crunch across the hardened earth. You pause beside an old boundary stone, rounded, moss-covered, forgotten by most, but not by you. Because you remember the stories behind it. This was where your uncle gave away land in marriage, where a neighbor once buried a blood price under a goat's skull, where you saw your cousin swear an oath with trembling hands and muddy boots. This wasn't just a rock. It was a legal record, Viking style. The law, in your world, wasn't made in halls or carved into cold marble. It lived in the land, in the songs, in the hearthside whispers that started with "back when your grandfather" and ended with someone muttering about sheep. And now, as you near the end of your journey, you begin to see how it all fits together, how love, land, and revenge weren't separate ideas, but threads braided into one long rope. The rope that held your world together. You think of the women who walked away from marriages with dowry in hand and their heads high, the men who calculated Vergild by moonlight, debating how much a broken promise weighed in silver, the children who grew up listening to saga and law alike, who understood that even a careless word could cost a farm. You remember the sacredness of the hearth, where the high seat wasn't just warm, but earned. The way a divorce didn't mean disgrace. Sometimes it meant freedom. The way vengeance could be legal, as long as it wasn't done on a feast day. Fringe fact. Some Viking families kept oral legal lineages, not just ancestry, but legal memory. One person would be trained to remember every dispute, every agreement, every shame and forgiveness. A walking archive of justice and pain. Historians still argue whether this system was sustainable, whether it truly offered fairness, whether it left too much in the hands of memory and mood. But to you, it was human, messy, flawed, alive. Now, it's changing. The scrolls are replacing stories. Christian courts are arriving with their pens and pews. Revenge is being rebranded as sin. Dowries are becoming silent, sealed documents. And the thing, still standing, but a little less wild, a little more watched. But some things remain. The shape of the land. The way someone's name still carries their father's honor, or shame. The echo of legal words you once heard beside a smoky fire, now spoken in softer tones by someone younger, someone watching, someone learning. Because Viking law was never just about rules. It was about balance, between love and property, between freedom and family, between silver and blood. And even as the world tilts toward change, the rope still holds, not unbroken, but braided strong. Now, the wind softens. The sky, still dim with the endless dusk of northern winters, glows faintly along the horizon. The snow no longer stings. It settles, gently, like ash from an old fire, like memory, You breathe out, and the air turns to mist. It's quiet. You imagine the hearth at your old home, the warmth of it, the flicker of flame on timber walls. You hear the creak of a wooden bench, the rustle of wool skirts, the low murmur of a story being told for the 100th time. You know how it ends, but still, you listen. Because knowing the end isn't why we remember. We remember because it anchors us. And in Viking life, the law wasn't a scroll tucked in a monk's robe. It was a feeling, a pause before an oath, a silence when an insult landed too hard, a glance exchanged over mead when a decision was made, wordless, binding. Tonight, you leave that world behind, but its rhythm follows you, in your own stories, in how you weigh right and wrong, in how you understand that justice isn't always clean, but it can be shared. So close your eyes, let the snow fall, let the fire fade to embers, and let the voices of long ago hum gently behind your dreams. End of script, sweet dreams.